So you have these two sides of God, right? You have this side where God is loving and is full of grace, but then you also have this side of God that is the wrathful God, and he's full of, anger and vengeance. And I know that we can sometimes wonder, how can a loving God be hateful? In this video, I want to talk about the nature of a king. So I know for some people, when they think of God, they can think of him as being, this angry being who doesn't want us to do anything, have any fun, and who is always trying to condemn us, right? And for them, it's hard to want to worship a God like that. Like, how can I worship a God that's not loving? I thought God was supposed to be full of love. For me, when I opened up the scriptures myself, that wasn't a hindrance that really came to me. When I read the scriptures, I realized that I was not living how I was supposed to be living according to our King. I never really questioned, the wrath of God and the God of vengeance. I just realized that I had been living the wrong way for a long time and I needed to get back on the right track. But on the flip side of that, I thought I understood the love of God intellectually. We can think that we have to work our way to God. If we don't work sin out of our lives, how can we be accepted? How can he just forgive us that easily? We can sometimes get caught in a battle of, in one season, we can just, bash people about their sin and not show the love of God. But then in other seasons, we can show too much grace and we don't talk about sin enough. And I think as we see like the contrast between both of these, the both sides of God, I guess what you would say. On one side, he is loving. On the other side, he is a God that wants us to overcome our sin and be obedient to him. The two stories that kind of paints this picture out for me is the parable of the son and the parable of the weeds. So you have in the parable of the son, right? The son, he had an inheritance. He lived with his father, but one day he decided, I want to take my inheritance and go do whatever I want to do. So he took his inheritance, he went out, he was in reckless living. Eventually he squandered his wealth and he hired himself out to servants and ended up living in a pig pen, eating with the pigs, right? And so he thought to himself, my father is the king. Why in the world am I living here when I can just go back to my father and hire myself out to him? So even in that saying right there, we can see like how far he had come from being in the right standing of his father over here. So now all of a sudden he feels like he has to hire himself out to his father. He comes back and his father accepts him with wide open arms. He accepts him back fully as his son. Even with all the sin that he did, he returned back to his father and returned back into his presence. The loving side of God. All right, but then we have the parable of the weeds. And in this parable, he's talking to his disciples and he's explaining the parable. And they are wondering, should we take up the weeds along with the wheat? The weeds were the seeds that the enemy came and planted in the garden or in the field. And so they ended up coming up together. And so they were wondering like, okay, should we pull the weeds up along with the wheat? In the parable, Jesus explained, let's wait to the end of age. I'll have my harvesters separate the weeds from the wheat. And then when we separate the weeds, we'll take the weeds, throw them out, burn them up. And then anything that was unrighteous or that did evil, we'll burn up as well. In this parable, we see the wrath of God. You can't just do anything that you want to do, right? There's a certain standard and a certain level of righteousness that we have to obtain. Granted, we can't obtain this righteousness on our own. This is why Jesus came for us, because he knew that it was no way that we would be able to do that. We cause our sin to separate us from God. And when sin doesn't separate us from God, the only thing that separates us from God is if we separate ourselves from God. And so Jesus paints this picture of a loving God, but then he also paints this picture of a wrathful God. So which is he? Is God a God that is going to send people to hell, or is he a God that is a loving God that loves everybody and everybody is saved? We see that he is a loving God. Then if you turn back to him, you will be accepted by him. But if you turn away from him and you become evil and separate yourself from him and do evil, wicked, sinful things and don't turn back to him, we see that this loving God will condemn you. And I think Jesus does he exemplifies this so perfectly of being an example of the grace of God, but also showing the wrath of God. And I don't want us to get to the point where we feel that we can do whatever we want to do, but I also don't want us to feel like we're condemned. So as always, I want you to know that the invitation to the kingdom is always open. And to my kings and queens, I invite you to the kingdom.